Welcome to FlightGlobal Focus, a podcast from FlightGlobal offering insight and analysis into the world of aviation. Join us every Friday for a review of the week's news, and again on Monday for a deep dive into one topic from the worlds of aerospace, defense, and airlines. I'm Ryan Finnerty, FlightGlobal's America's Defense Reporter, and today we'll be discussing the future of U.S. naval aviation. The U.S. Navy is jokingly referred to as the second largest air force in the world, with the U.S. Air Force taking the top spot. The Navy's inventory includes fourth and fifth generation fighters, large UAVs, ground-based patrol jets, and much more. The admiral in charge of that fleet, known as the Air Boss, recently gave a talk at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He teased plans for a sixth-generation fighter and shared why the Navy thinks its new training jet doesn't need to be able to land on an aircraft carrier. Joining me to discuss that and more is Craig Hoyle, Flight's European defense editor. Craig, good to speak with you today.
Hi, Ryan. I can't believe the podcasts come again around so fast.
Yes, every week, although not every week for a defense topic. Let's get into it, Craig. I was thinking we could start by looking at the Navy's plans for fighter aircraft modernization. That was a big topic of discussion at the recent talk given by the Air Boss. And like the U.S. Air Force, the Navy has plans in the works for a sixth generation fighter, which is known as FAXX, kind of colloquially in the DC circles. But unlike the U.S. Air Force's sixth generation program, the Navy's aircraft is getting mixed support in Washington. While the Trump administration has said that it is, quote, all in on the Air Force's F-47, which is being made by Boeing, the White House wants to cut funding for FAXX to a minimal level. Current indications are, though, in Congress that there will still be funding for that program. And during his recent talk at CSIS, Vice Admiral Daniel Cheever, who is the Air Boss, seemed confident that the new fighter will be funded. Cheever's official title is Commander of Naval Air Forces, but within the Navy, he's most commonly known as the Air Boss. And here's what he had to say about plans for the Navy's new carrier-based sixth generation fighter.
Yeah, so I think for sixth generation, I see a maritime version of the aircraft that starts at the carrier, is made for the carrier, and is a complete carrier version. It will be replacing both the Super Hornet and the Growler. So it is a combination of all things, and it's going to be a very exciting aircraft. I'm looking forward to the down select. I'll leave it to the professional acquisition folks and the folks that do that. But I'm looking forward to that because that sixth generation means air superiority in that time frame in the future, which means sea control. And as long as you have air superiority, you have sea control around the globe. And so that sixth generation really ensures that you have that sea control and that manned-unmanned teaming, I think, with collaborative combat aircraft.
Craig, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting approach. I mean, when we talk about sixth generation platforms, we assume we're talking about loads of exquisite technology and low observable design features, which you need for stealth performance, so something like internal weapons bays. But what we know about the earlier generation of stealth aircraft and the coatings that are on those aircraft, so that's F-22, F-35 and the B-2 bomber, is these materials are really difficult, they're manpower intensive and they're expensive to maintain. And the maritime environment is about the worst you can possibly encounter for putting stress on something like that. So you've got damaging damp, saltwater conditions. So a real challenge to fly that sort of aircraft from a carrier deck. So as the Air Boss said, the Navy's thinking is that by having this mix of assets, so fourth and fifth generation Super Hornets as they phase down and the F-35, then by adding the air superiority type, that it's going to round out this mix of air power credentials that it needs. And to an extent, the Navy's lacked that since it retired the F-14 Tomcat, which is shockingly nearly 20 years ago now. So, I mean, the fact they haven't had an air superiority fighter on the carriers hasn't been a problem because in that period, the Navy's been operating in permissive environments. So you had the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, or currently they're engaged against Houthi rebels. So you don't need that type of aircraft there. But it's certainly going to matter if the US military finds itself in a near-peer conflict with China. So the Navy clearly feels that just pitching up with what you'd say is 100,000 tons of diplomacy might not be enough of a deterrent without this extra capability that will come along.
I think that sustainment point that you raised, Craig, is really interesting because that's been a big issue for the Navy with the current 5th generation fighter, the F-35C, the carrier version of that fighter, both with some of the issues you outlined with just sort of general aircraft maintenance, but some specific challenges being deployed aboard the carrier, things like the Pratt & Whitney F-135 engine. They couldn't really do resupply aboard the carrier for an entire engine until they started rolling out the Osprey, the CMV-22 variant for carrier resupply, and that sort of enabled them to bring entire engines out to the carrier. But there's still a lot of issues, not specific to the F-35, but with any aircraft doing maintenance at sea. And I know the Navy's looking at using 3D printing, or they call it additive manufacturing, to try and be able to produce some smaller, less critical parts that can still reduce aircraft readiness on board the actual aircraft carrier. But I think you're right, that will end up being a really key piece to look at, especially if these are larger or more complicated aircraft than even some of the current ones that we've got. One of the things that we heard Admiral Cheever mention in his clip was collaborative combat aircraft. And these are the new generation of uncrewed jets that will assist manned fighters with a range of new weapons and other types of support like electronic warfare. The Navy is planning to fly its first carrier-based uncrewed aircraft later this year from the ground, and then from an aircraft carrier next year in 2026. And that's expected to be the USS George H.W. Bush and Nimitz class. That aircraft is the Boeing MQ-25, which has been in development for a number of years. It's an autonomous tanker that will provide aerial refueling support to the carrier air wings. That mission is currently filled by the F-18 Super Hornet strike fighters, which are reassigned from their normal duties to provide what is called buddy tanking to the rest of the air wing. And that crucially takes those F-18s out of the fight, loading them down with extra fuel rather than a full weapons payload. And they can't be used for frontline missions while they're giving that support. The MQ-25 Stingray aims to change that while also becoming the Navy's first uncrewed aircraft to fly operationally off the carrier, not just in a test capacity. And here's what Admiral Cheever, the air boss, had to say about that.
The freeing up strike fighters to be strike fighters and not have to do a tanking role is the really exciting part of that. It really gives us the capability and capacity beyond what we have currently. And so that's a bump in both capability and capacity. That's pretty cool. Excited to go out there and see that fly for the first time. And then it is also the key that unlocks manned-unmanned teaming on an aircraft carrier. And I'm talking big platforms next to each other, both manned and unmanned, flying, integrating, and doing the whole thing during deployment, and then learning. And I think that opens up the future for collaborative combat aircraft, other unmanned assets to come.
What do you think about that, Craig? Is it a brilliant idea, or should the Navy just stick with what it has that's already working pretty well?
It's an interesting one. I mean, I'm going to go back quite a few years now, and it raised a lot of eyebrows when the US Navy decided the MQ-25 was going to serve as an airborne refueler, because a lot of its earlier interest had been around using that sort of platform as an unmanned combat air vehicle, or UCAV. So on the tanker issue, having to use a strike platform like Super Hornet for buddy tanking obviously isn't ideal. It diverts that asset away from doing a more combat-facing task. Beyond that, it's also limited in how much fuel it can pass on and how long it can stay on station. So we're only going to know how effective Stingray is going to be in doing that mission and its integration with the rest of the air wing once it starts to deploy next year. But I think what's going to be more interesting is how the Navy looks to move forward from it. So take something like the MQ-25 to pick up some of those other dull, dirty and dangerous jobs. or to add combat mass alongside its man types in an armed role. And it feels like the service has already done quite a lot of work down that route with the tanker. So if it is going to go along the same sort of lines as the US Air Force with its CCA, then it feels like it's sort of a few steps down the road already. And then looking sort of more broadly, there's quite a few other nations who are also looking at the manned-unmanned teaming or the hybrid air wing. That includes the UK, which is going to do it with its Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers. And then there's people like Turkey who've been testing what would previously have been a helicopter carrier vessel and putting fixed-wing UAVs on it. So this is definitely an area that more nations are going to go down, and it's definitely not a passing fad to put this manned-unmanned teaming capability together on a ship.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Craig, to speculate as to whether or not the MQ-25's role could expand within the U.S. Navy. There is some discussion already underway in Washington that might happen, whether it would be airborne reconnaissance ISR or some kind of electronic warfare or a communications relay has been suggested, because that aircraft has a really incredible range, which, as you pointed out, is a big limiting factor to the current buddy tanker arrangement. And one of the things I'm watching for and maybe anticipating is whether or not the U.S. Air Force or maybe other allied air forces might look to adopt this. You know, it's obviously designed for the aircraft carrier, but we've seen Australia or Canada have flown carrier-based or carrier-designed aircraft as their primary land-based fighter for a number of years now, the F-18. And I think this MQ-25 could probably provide a much more affordable and flexible option to either expand the capability of an existing tanker fleet, or for maybe smaller air forces that want to have some kind of airborne tanker without maybe the resources to field a whole fleet of KC-46s or A330s, to be able to bring some of that into their inventory. And as you know, the U.S. Air Force is kind of wrestling with this notion of how do you do aerial tanking in a contested environment, and they're debating, should they build a stealth tanker, for lack of a better term, something that can penetrate contested airspace, or do they use a kind of conventional tanker and outfit it with electronic warfare and maybe some protective countermeasures to make it be a little more survivable. And I think this unmanned refueler like an MQ-25 presents a really interesting option, where you could sort of have, maybe an MQ-25 could go out and take on fuel from a KC-46 at some point in the future, or just launch on its own from an ACE type concept, which you've covered a lot, agile combat employment. You could scatter these MQ-25s around and launch and have them meet with stealth aircraft or other platforms in flight, and they're less of a concern on the survivability front, obviously, because they don't have a pilot. Do you think that we might see, either with the MQ-25 or some new design that's yet to come out, unmanned tanking really evolve in that way?
So some of the people who work on tankers have been looking at this for quite a long time. Airbus has done quite a lot of research work where it's a system called A3R or A4R, where they're going to automate the tanking capability. So when you're using a boom, it will automatically line itself up with the receiver aircraft and then sort out the transfer. So it's something that could be done. There's a lot of technical challenges to it. And as you raised, I mean, there are a lot of nations who just don't have tanker capability. And while we talk about near peer capability with Russia and China, they have handfuls of tanker aircraft in China versus hundreds in the US Air Force. So tanking's a sort of very important mission that does get overlooked quite a bit. But yeah, I think automation will come at some point, but it's much more challenging than perhaps it feels it should be.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting that Boeing has been able to successfully roll that out with the MQ-25. We know they did some land-based tests a few years ago where they did successfully transfer fuel from a test version of the MQ-25 to a number of aircraft, including the F-35 and the F-18. So the technology does work, at least in principle, and the Navy seems bullish on it. So we can assume that it's looking promising as they move into flight trials. And going back to the Navy, we're going to cover one more topic from Admiral Cheever's remarks last week. And this is a topic that you've written about, Craig. In April, you wrote a story, really interesting one, noting that the U.S. Navy had dropped its requirement for the new trainer jet to be able to perform simulated landings on an aircraft carrier. And this came after the Navy had already decided its new trainer did not need to land on the actual aircraft carrier. And that is a capability the current T-45 Ghost Hawk can do. It can do carrier landings and do these practice carrier landings using a ground-based airfield. And that practice is called field carrier landing practice. It's a step below landing on the actual aircraft carrier, where pilots who are in training or doing recertification use ground-based airfields to simulate a recovery at sea. The process involves doing repeated touch and goes, but not the use of an arresting wire as you would with an actual aircraft carrier recovery. After the retirement of the T-45, new pilots are instead going to practice those skills in whatever aircraft they're actually assigned to fly. So it could be the F-18, it could be the F-35, the E-2D, whichever aircraft that they are actually assigned to. And instead, under this new program, aviators will graduate flight school, receive their wings, and then report to what the Navy calls fleet replacement squadrons for advanced training with their assigned aircraft. And here's what the Air Boss had to say about that.
And what I need is a competent aviator that's winged to come to my fleet replacement squadron and be ready to start doing high-end tactics, right? I need their basics to be so solid that they know how to fly, do wingman stuff, and be in control of their aircraft and handle any emergency, any basic weapon system, that kind of stuff, and then come and be ready to learn.
And interestingly, that decision was apparently made in large part due to the effectiveness of the new automated landing assistance systems that the Navy has been incorporating into its aircraft and the new Ford-class aircraft carriers, which will eventually replace the current Nimitz-class ships. The first of those ships, the USS Gerald R. Ford, is currently on deployment to Europe, your neck of the woods, Craig, and it recently made a port call in Marseille, France. During his talk at CSIS, Admiral Cheever shared a story about his own recent experience landing an F-18 on the Ford and how that shaped the decision to eliminate the carrier landing requirement from the new trainer aircraft.
It's because that precision landing mode that NavAir put into the aircraft is incredible. I don't want to say anything about my first 1,100 passes, but this pass on the Ford, I came around the corner. And you remember, you're the Air Boss, so you got to make a good landing right in front of all the folks that are watching. And I clicked the button, and it flew the best pass I've ever seen. Literally, the ball didn't move, and I landed exactly where I wanted to land. Incredible capability.
What do you think about that, Craig? Is it a sensible choice by the Navy to reduce the cost of a new trainer and eliminate some of these more robust features of the aircraft, or are they asking for trouble in the future with competency of their pilots?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting one because it's hard to be absolutely certain whether that decision around the UJTS requirement was actually driven by the operational need or whether it's a lack of options from industry. Because you think companies who are going after this deal are offering trainer aircraft that already exist. So things like the Boeing T7, the Leonardo M346. And you sort of look at it and say, well, it can't be that hard, just, stick a tower hook on the back or something like that. But it's actually a really complicated undertaking that they're reluctant to do. So you have to do a lot of strengthening on the airframe. You've got to beef up the landing gear, put the tail hook on. So it's partly industry. I don't think we're leaping to integrate this. But I mean, I'll put my hand up, so I'm a completely novice observer on this. I've got one honorary tailhook from being in the back of a C2 Greyhound many years ago. But it does feel like the full field landing should still be a requirement in training. A lot of it can be done in the simulator, but the physical act of actually getting the gear on the deck surely still has to matter. And that's even when you've got kit like JPALs and the automation on the approach system that aircraft like the F-35 have got. So they make the pilot's life a lot easier, but it's still a difficult job. And I think on not requiring the aircraft to, even on land, they're talking about just doing down to the wave off. So you don't actually have to land it on the simulated deck on the ground. I think there's a danger that in a few years, the Navy might look on this the same way that the US Army now is doing with its Airbus helicopters UH-72 Lakota trainer. The Army's a bit concerned. I think we're about 5 years into using the Lakota, and Army chiefs are concerned that the pilots aren't leaving with the right skills to actually fly the aircraft because the automation is so good. So I think if you go too far in relying on the automation, there's a risk your new pilots won't have that experience that they need for when things do go wrong. And let's not forget that the carrier, it's a runway, but it's moving, rolling and pitching all the time. It is a big task to get it on the deck. And I think on the cost side, we talk about downloading training. So you take things away from the front line, and this is what the Goshawk does at the moment. So there's a clear cost implication if you're going to do more of the live flying and the carrier training with your frontline jets. That's got a cost implication. And obviously, if something goes wrong, an F-35 costs a lot more money than a T-45.
Yeah, I had the same thought on the cost and complexity of the aircraft. I'm sure that I'm not a pilot myself, but I would think the trainers are a little bit simpler. I know that was Boeing's goal with the T-7 to make a very streamlined, easy to use platform for the student pilots. And, I think one aspect where you can really see that is when you see the photos of the trainer aircraft just by themselves, they look like a jet. But then when you see them side by side with the combat aircraft, you realize how much smaller they are compared to, when you see a T-7 next to an F-15, for example, it's a percentage of the size. And I'm sure it would be you hear all these stories when you read books or listen to interviews with Navy pilots or talk to them about how stressful and intimidating that first carrier landing is, and then the first night landing and first bad weather landing when the deck is pitching, like you said. And you think doing that live in this huge, powerful F-35 or F-18 rather, for the first time, just adds an even greater level of stress and complexity versus having the trainer aircraft to do it in. Maybe not any less dangerous, but certainly more stressful, I would think. So I think you're right to point that out. And it's an interesting parallel you drew with the UH-72, the trainer helicopter that the Army's using, which is another story we've covered quite extensively. And that is exactly what the generals in the Army are saying, is that there's too much automation in the UH-72 and the pilots aren't getting the basic skills they need. Airbus has pushed back on that, which we've covered, and said, well, you can just turn the automation off and they can fly it like a conventional unassisted helicopter. So I would assume there's similar options with JPALs and some of the other automated landing assistance features that the Navy's looking into. But it is a really interesting topic. And it seems like perhaps, as you pointed out, it's maybe driven as much by industrial availability of aircraft as much as anything else, that they didn't want to maybe go through what the Air Force did of designing a brand new jet from the ground up. They wanted to take what was available in the market and work with that, and maybe are building requirements around that. And we should note that those full requirements haven't come out yet. The Navy is expected to formally start the UJTS procurement process by the end of this year, maybe in the next couple of months even. Well, Craig, I think that's about all the time we have today, unfortunately. Thanks for joining me, and we'll speak soon. I look forward to the next episode with you.
Yeah, it's been great to talk about this topic, actually, because it has its detractors. Some people in the UK don't see the worth of having two big aircraft carriers, but carrier aviation is going to be around for a long time yet. India and China are very big on it as well. So I think it's going to be something we can talk about many more times in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. We should note that the Royal Navy's HMS Prince of Wales just made a port call in Tokyo after doing some operations in the Pacific. So definitely an enduring sign of global power. And a lot of people debate whether or not the aircraft carrier's time has come to an end. But we see China is building their own fleet. So clearly they see some value in it. And the US is going forward with replacing the Nimitz classes and bringing in the new Ford class. So it's definitely going to be a topic that we're covering for a long time to come. So thanks for joining me to talk about it, Craig, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Ryan. Bye for now.
If you want to read more about the U.S. Navy's modernization efforts, we'll have links to all our coverage in the show notes. We'll also have a link to the full talk Admiral Cheever gave at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. He covers a lot more ground, including insight from recent combat deployments to the Middle East, the Navy's success with the E-2D airborne early warning and control aircraft, and plans for the new AIM-174B long-range air-to-air missile. Listen back to our earlier episode on the recent air battle between India and Pakistan if you need a catch-up on the importance of those missiles in establishing air superiority. We'll be back on Friday for a roundup of the week's aviation news with some other members of the FlightGlobal team, and again on Monday for another deep dive. FlightGlobal Focus is a production of FlightGlobal with audio production by Lucy Johnson. If you have comments about today's episode or want to become a sponsor of the podcast, please email podcast@flightglobal.com. Find future episodes wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. I'm Ryan Finnerty. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time for FlightGlobal Focus.